Oh my goodness. That was just an insane trial to watch. Unless you've been living under a rock, you likely have heard that Derek Chauvin was found guilty on all counts: murder and manslaughter. People in the mainstream media absolutely predicted this was going to happen. I am flabbergasted. I'm completely surprised. Because I wasn't listening to a lot of pundits talk about this, I was listening to experienced lawyers' opinions. Lawyers from all realms of politics who had all sorts of opinions on the case and political backgrounds. And most of them were analyzing that there would just be too much reasonable doubt for this result. Floyd's heart condition, his lethal dose of fentanyl, the fact that positional asphyxia is very uncommon in people who are not obese. There were lots of factors that you'd think would at least bring up some questions. But apparently the jury disagreed, and we'll get to the potential reasons for that in a second here. This, however, is likely not the end for Chauvin or his case, though. I've been listening to a lot of Will Chamberlain from Human Events and his analysis, where he pointed out the Supreme Court may even reverse this decision. There may be a retrial due to obvious due process problems, failure to sequester the jury, overwhelming public pressure, and of course the glaring fact that all of the jurors lived in Minneapolis. Minneapolis, which has been constantly at threat of riots and being burnt to the ground. Think about it. When the question is, convict this man or your city will burn down, and if people find out who you are, you may be hunted down and killed, that's going to impact your decision making just a little bit. But I'm sure this is all stuff you have heard before if you've been listening to coverage and critique of the trial, and it's not exactly what I wanted to talk about today. Just wanted to open with that a bit. I think there is a far more fascinating analysis to be made here that I know BLM have considered but hasn't really been acknowledged by many publicly yet. And that is two things. One, the conviction of Derek Chauvin is a disaster for BLM. And two, by blaming Derek Chauvin for Floyd's death, BLM have absolved the system. Let me explain that second part first. The woke left have spent years telling us that it is not individuals who are to blame for evil, but rather systems. For example, if someone yells a racist slur on a baseball team, many, especially conservatives, would say, well, that is just one asshole. Otherwise, for the most part, baseball players are good people. Progressives will respond, no, actually it's systemic. It's that sports are filled with systemic racism from the top to the bottom, and the whole thing needs to be torn apart and rebuilt. We've seen this with footy teams here in Australia. This has also been the argument for the police as well. It's not just a few bad apples, it is the whole system. It's the culture, it's the way they're trained, it's the fact that they have guns, it's the fact that the police exist at all in the first place. Yet, for some reason, progressives have abandoned this logic entirely in the Chauvin trial. They could have blamed the Minneapolis Police Department for killing George Floyd, the system, their allowance of chokeholds, the teaching of aggression, the fact that police are given the ability to restrain and arrest people for minor crimes in the first place. All arguments and approaches that activists could have taken. We even could have seen the police department itself taken to court, or the people who wrote the manuals taken to court. You know, the systemic factors. But no. The prosecution instead bolstered the narrative that the MPD had zero responsibility in the death of George Floyd, even working with them to support the case against Chauvin, ultimately absolving the department and establishing that the training and the systems had no error. It was 100% on Chauvin. Meanwhile, and surprisingly, it was the defense that made the systemic argument, submitting 30 pages of evidence to the court showing how the MPD trained cops to kneel on someone's neck. Even the public website outlined that you can use your leg for a neck restraint, which, surprisingly, all of that has been removed from the website now, despite the fact that apparently the MPD did nothing at all wrong. Odd. Eric Nelson, Chauvin's lawyer, was the one who cross-examined police leadership. He was the one questioning them on their practices, the gray zones, what sort of force cops are allowed to use, all the stuff that would normally be in line with BLM arguments about how cops are trained to be aggressive, trained to use violent restraints, trained to try to up those arrest numbers. BLM were always the main activists arguing that the culture and the demands of the policing system were inherently unethical, which is why you need to disband them, which is why the system needs to be held to account. And yet BLM and the progressive left were so desperate to get Chauvin, to get their sacrifice at the altar, that they were willing to let the system that created him be let completely off the hook, completely absolve them. The prosecution finalizing the narrative that no, the MPD would never do such a thing. Their training was perfect. They were the pinnacle of goodness and decency, abused and corrupted by the act of the lone rogue agent, Derek Chauvin. And I suppose that's ultimately what the jury decided, and what progressives in the media are cheering on now. Which is why it has been so interesting to watch this pivot from Democrats, where all of a sudden they are back to blaming the system again. Obama and Bernie Sanders making statements like, "This is great, but the battle isn't over. This was just a brief glimpse of accountability, not justice. What we actually need to do is root out the cancer of systemic racism. We need to deal with the systems of policing again." And you had your chance here, but no, it was one bad apple apparently with Chauvin. And while it's fascinating to watch this all, it's not entirely surprising to see this pivot. Because, as I mentioned earlier, BLM and Democrats know that Chauvin's conviction is a disaster for them. They cannot have peace. They cannot have a system that sends cops to jail. They are not in the business of justice. They are in the business of demanding justice. So if they actually get what they purport to want, their purpose is fulfilled, and the money stops coming in. The death of George Floyd made BLM so wealthy, more money than they have had from anything else in history. Just between May and December of last year, BLM made $10.6 billion. But now that people have closure on the Floyd case, well, their main source of political power and income is gone. They've riled people up for years now, telling them they need to riot, scream, shout, and burn for justice, and they got what they wanted. And everyone who has been kept at this artificial level of urgency for ages now finally has a chance to say, "Oh my gosh, it's over. I can take a breath and relax, finally." Except BLM and the Democrats. This is where they panic. That's where the fear sets in for them, because they can't let people relax. They cannot let people stop paying attention and think, "Hey, we got the bad man, it's over now." Because this momentum has been way too beneficial for them. They've been winning elections off it. They've been buying $3 million mansions in California with it. So they will keep on fanning that hysteria, and they will keep hunting people down no matter what. Even if it's a cop shooting a woman, literally swinging a knife at someone, like in the last couple days we've seen, they'll want that cop's head on a platter, and they'll claim it is all an injustice. The battle isn't over. We have to get this one, and then the next one, and the next one. The crisis must go on. We must defeat the system. And of course, the system is just this non-tangible idea that will always exist for them, because they need it to always exist. Once again, we're back to the system. And it doesn't matter that progressives spent the whole trial cheering on the idea that the system had no involvement in Chauvin's response, training, or behavior, because this is not about consistency. It's not about reason, and it is certainly not about Black lives. Otherwise, you wouldn't have Breonna Taylor's mother saying BLM was just a giant grift who wouldn't give aid or money to her family. You certainly wouldn't have activists advocating burning down Black neighborhoods if this were about Black lives. This is all about money and power at the end of the day. And it's not going to end with the Chauvin conviction, even if they shut down the whole damn police in America, in the world. It wouldn't end. It wouldn't be over. Because they have to create problems to make money, to get political power. So get ready for a rocky future, because I'm predicting that BLM are about to put the Salem witch trials to shame in their quest for crisis.